Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. We have today Halevi'S winners and losers in the economic and financial pandemic. Joseph Halevi has been teaching for 12 years at the International University College, and he's been one of the most high-profile figures at the University of Sydney in the Department of Political Economy. His main title to glory is being a friend of Jan Toporowski, who's here with us as well. You got the floor, Joseph.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And yes, indeed, Jan and I know each other now 30 years. And so first of all, the winner and loser issue is depending on the time frame that you want to locate it, right? In the sense that, for instance, if you take the 1930, who was the winner, who was the loser in the 1930? Well, one can say that in the 1930, before the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, the winner and the loser, the winners were Germany and Japan, because they managed to quite successfully come out of the Depression. In connection with militarism, Germany, through the program of remilitarization after 1934 and stuff like that. And Japan basically got into the war right away with the Manchuria story in 1931. And the period of the 30s in Japan is considered by economic historians as the period of heavy and chemical industrialization. That's how they call it, which means that the legacy of the 30s remained after the Second World War. But of course, then Japan in 1945 came out to be as a very big loser, right? And so did Germany. So the issue is, how do we frame the question of winner and loser? I don't know. So I will, on this basis, I will try to present first what picture am I making of the situation, and then I will try to elaborate a bit on that, okay? Well, first of all, this present crisis, I think now most people would agree with that. This present crisis is different in economic terms. I'm not a specialist on viruses and stuff like that. But on economic terms, this present crisis has the simultaneity of a blockage in production, right? Because production has been held back, withdrawn, and people have been, as a result, fired or put in some kind of special lower level treatment in terms of wages and stuff like that. And other activities have been blocked. And this creates what we can call it a supply shock. But it's a supply shock that leads automatically to a fall in demand as a result of investment being withheld, as a result of wages not being paid, unemployment benefits or other type of social measures well below wages being substituted for wages, and the result is, of course, a decline in demand, plus in big services like travel services, air services, etc., etc. So this simultaneity, in my view, people who know history, economic history better than I do, may correct me, but at least in the 20th century, up to now, this simultaneity of blockage in production and collapse in demand, that simultaneity or that strict proximity, it's something new, okay? And it creates very big, a new situation altogether. In this context, however, when we get to the unfolding of the disease itself, of the virus itself, I think it is possible to establish a relationship between the degree of structural completeness of the economies and the capacity to face up to the particular situation of the virus. What do I mean by structural completeness? Okay, so forget GDP. Okay, GDP is not it's an indicator which is good for financial markets, because financial markets don't care about specificities, in my view. So, but there is an atlas which has been developed, written and produced in 2009 by MIT, Harvard and MIT people, which is called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And they also produced an index of economic complexity. How is economic complexity defined in that context? It is defined as the capacity, internal capacity to produce technologies and capital goods. So it's actually very, very close to, I mean, it can be mapped onto and very close to a notion which is deeply in Marxian, in real Marxian economics, not the Marxian economics where people say, you know, falling rate of profit or etc. It's that type of Marxian economics which focuses on the capacity of capital goods to develop capital goods. You follow what I mean? It's the internal reproductive mechanism and expansionary mechanism of the capital goods sector, right? Which means a multiplicity of sectors, okay, which are well ahead of the final consumption item. Now, usually the top countries, as far as the index of industrial complexity is concerned, of economic complexity, are Japan, always number one, and then Korea, South Korea, and then you have Germany, you have Taiwan, you have Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic. These are the top. And if you look carefully, these are countries which have the internal mechanism for the production of technologies. Okay, that's what it is. The technologies are embedded in capital goods. Therefore, it can be different myriads of capital goods, different type of capital goods, but these are the countries. Interesting, United States is not at the top of that. It's actually 14 in the last count. Britain is not on the top, okay? So it is quite interesting. And actually a country which has fallen from being potentially on the top is Netherlands, is Holland, because they are not producing this kind of stuff anymore. They've gone into industrialized services. Okay, now there is a connection between the fact that those countries have been more able to control the spread of the disease in respect to other countries, because they have the technologies to produce the capacity, the productive capacity to produce the ventilators, to produce the kits, the test kits and stuff like that. So these countries are best placed so far in addressing future diseases, because we should remember that there was a speech now in, I think, 2012 or something like that, in the second presidency. I don't remember if it was the first presidency of Obama or the second presidency of Obama. I don't remember that. It was a speech in which Obama talked about the new nature of pandemics, of epidemics, okay? That they will travel through planes, that they will be. So these aspects were actually known. They were known. The nature of these epidemics was known, not the specific, not the cause, but it was known, the spreading mechanism, okay? And they were caught unawares, but the countries that reacted best or more systematically, were the countries that I have spoken about. They did not react immediately, so they got caught out. But they managed to control countries which don't belong to this kind of structured economies. New Zealand and Australia are perhaps among the least structured, but this was contingent or the fact of the ability to immediately intervene. Not intervene in terms of physical capacity, but to block the travel, essentially. And they blocked it immediately, regardless of other considerations. And that's what saved the day, essentially. And in fact, in a country like Australia, they were very much worried that should the disease strike on a vast basis, Australia would not have the means to face to it because of lack of appropriate productive capacity. Okay, so one thing that we see is the structured countries were more capable of addressing the issue once they woke up to it than others, because they have the productive capacities, the technological embodiment in capital goods. That's what it is. Okay, this is one consideration. Out of which, now I would like to move to a second type of consideration. Initially, until a few weeks ago, Jan Toporowski may correct me on that, a few weeks, a month or so ago, or a month and a half perhaps, the whole attitude, but I don't remember having seen it in the FT, in the Financial Times, but in other papers, in other Bloomberg, and all these sorts of other type of things. They were all expecting and hoping, I mean, it was kind of a desired expectation that the recovery, the recovery would be V-shaped. So you have a V-shaped cycle, right? Not a cycle, a steep descent and a steep ascent, right? A recovery, V-shaped. Now this has receded. I don't think that they expect the upper side of the V. Okay, I don't think so. I think that this is gone. So the general view is that the crisis, the fall in output, the recovery, it will be quite slow if we are going to have a recovery. Meanwhile, the situation is still worsening. What is the reason? The main reason is called China. And this is the main reason. That is to say, the 2009 recovery, the recovery from the 2008, 2009 crisis was a combination of United States expenditures, but they were not so big as I mean, not so big as to pull out the world. But there was this big, huge impulse generated by China, but through liquidity creation, and they started spending, and that was the big recovery that created, lifted the world out of the 2008-2009 recession, along with the United States. These two factors. Now the China factor is missing here. Okay, it won't be the same way as it used to be in 2009. So the China factor is missing, and the US factor is not as strong. Although it is the largest program that they have, it's not as strong. So at this point, the picture is not so bright in my view. It's not so bright. So what we have to discuss is what are the forces, what are the elements, the factors that operate within within this framework, which is not such a bright framework. Okay. The crisis in the United States is very big. Okay. It's really very big. The health crisis is very big. So the element that this COVID story has uncovered, has shown rather, people who were following the situation in terms of the health policies and stuff like that, they knew it all along. I mean, enough to read The Guardian or Le Monde less. But anyway, in order to understand what was happening in the United States over the years in that respect, but what it has uncovered is fundamental vulnerability, in my view. And the vulnerability is essentially connected to the United States. It's the United States which is very, very vulnerable in this respect. And on the United States falls the entire world monetary system. This is so, I cannot make prediction, but the world monetary system depends upon the United States. I may be wrong, but because also world demand in the end depends upon the United States. The United States is the fundamental referential country for Europe, which is EU now, EU. I'm leaving Britain aside, no, because Britain has just come out, although it's still part, but it's just come out. I mean, in terms of trade and stuff, it's still part. EU is a net exporter, and if you look at the net export position, is the United States is the dominant factor, is the dominant pole. For China too, China no longer has these big, huge surpluses that it had before. It had, say, 10 years ago, or in the first decade of this century. They don't have those big surpluses. But if you look at the relations, at the trade relations of United States of China, you will see that the United States is the net export position of China, determines the net export position of China. So it does for Japan. So the United States is a kind of a place, is really a global market where net output are being directed in terms of final markets. So the vulnerability of the United States is absolutely a crucial element to understand whether the system can be stabilized or not. So other people should tell me whether this is how vulnerable the United States is becoming. But what is interesting is that the United States, when Governor Cuomo was talking about the need for medical supplies, ventilators in the United States during the big phase of the crisis, even the New York Times, they pointed out how the United States was lacking the structural factors in order to operate quickly in that sphere. And in fact, there was also a tiff between Trump, between the US government and India, for India to immediately let a number of export of some chemical products necessary for some kind of medication, which India reduced allowing those exports, reduced the export in order to keep them for itself during the crisis. So this shows not only the internationalization of production network, but the vulnerability, structural vulnerability of certain countries. Most countries are structurally vulnerable, except a few. Most countries are structurally vulnerable. Okay. Now, within this framework, what is happening? And you can interrupt me. How many minutes do I have got left? How many minutes I've got left, Pepe? How many minutes?
I would say another 10 minutes to go.
Okay. Okay.
And then we'll have the debate.
Okay. So the let us look now at what happens within this situation in terms of sectors, of branches of the economy. What is happening? Now I have asked Pepe to see a good paper, a very good article which appeared in The Guardian, but actually it's taken from an American paper called Intercept, The Intercept.
Yes, you'll
by
find
Naomi
it
Klein.
in the chat, okay? Naomi Klein's article, you'll find the link in the chat.
Yeah. And that article, I'm not going to summarize because it's a very articulated article. And Naomi Klein is not she's not an analyst in the sense that she does not derive these things from specific theoretical modeling. She has a view of big companies, of what monopoly capital does, okay? That's the right thing to have, okay? And then she looks how these guys actually operate. And what she points out is the change, the acceleration of the pace by the big tech companies, by Google. She focused on Eric Schmidt in particular, who is the former boss of Google, in order to get as much as possible public money on the basis of creating the technologies which are useful to generate contactless transactions. You follow me? Okay? Because humans are a biohazard, okay? Humans are biohazard, whereas machines are not, okay? Are not a biohazard. And therefore, to push further for the development of drones and then connect it with military and security, because the same guy is also the chairperson of the National Security Commission in the United States for artificial intelligence, to push further for artificial intelligence. And this is all part, this is what I'm not saying the new monopoly, but this is what a big chunk of monopoly capital is today. It goes into that because it connects with military technology, it connects with a perception of a view about China, the necessary to compete against China, not to be outcompeted, as a matter of fact, by China. So it basically drags along the entire military industrial complex of the United States. So the argument by Naomi Klein, which is quite correct, in my view, is that the crisis has accelerated, as a matter of fact, the power of these groups, monopoly capital type of groups. I'm interested in that, not in conspiratorial terms. Of course, monopoly capital means that you are not dependent upon the market, the vagaries of the market. Monopoly capital means that your companies are strong enough to influence government decision, to determine government policies and stuff like that. So this is one element. The second element is there was in Libération, which is the French paper. If people want to read French, I can circulate that too. There was an interview with a guy who is mostly an economic philosopher, epistemologist, rather than an economist, but he's quite smart. And his name is Philip Mirowski. And he gave an interview to Libération, where he said, the left is wrong in assuming that after the COVID crisis, things will be there can be a Green New Deal, there can be something more progressive. He says, no, there might be a Green New Deal because what he calls the neoliberals have organized themselves. They have in United States, they have derived all the lessons of the 2008-2009 crisis, and they are in position to address these issues in the interest, in consistently with their own view. And he mentioned particularly the secretary, the treasurer of the United States, a guy called Mnuchin. I don't know whether I pronounce his, it must be a Russian origin name, Mnuchin, who was a member of Goldman Sachs and that sort of stuff, and organized the entire package of support decided by the American administration in that perspective. There is also an interview by Tom Ferguson with a journal radio station called Naked Capitalism, where Tom Ferguson points out that most of the money that was earmarked in the United States for small support of small business ended up, in fact, for big business. Okay, so what we can see is, on the whole, is a strengthening of the position of monopoly capital politically, sociologically, and with people becoming more unemployed, more on precarious, employed in precarious part-time casual jobs. By the way, this push, as Naomi Klein points out correctly, this push of extending drones, extending Amazon type of deliveries, etc., actually means that the number of people that will be employed in this kind of activities will increase significantly, but will increase in a precarious status. Their precarious status will not be changed. They will expand the numbers. There are more people in the precarious status. Okay, that's so.
Yes, Joseph. The link to Ferguson's interview again in the chat. You'll find it. And Tom will be our next speaker next Monday. Go on.
So, shall I speak about Europe? No, I don't want to speak about Europe now, because it's small stuff.
Complete. I'm sure that there will be questions about.
Not for Europeans.
So that's basically, that's the story. So what you have, big chunks of monopoly capital, the new type, but also connected. They will take with themselves also the other sectors of monopoly capital. Okay. They will become stronger. They are becoming stronger. They're getting more public money, etc., etc. This is remarkable about United States, right? Why it's remarkable? Because United States, this guy who is the chairman of the Security Commission on National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, is asking for a lot of money of infrastructure. But you know that a lot of US infrastructure is collapsing. So it's not the infrastructure that you and I are thinking about, like bridges, like that sort of stuff. The infrastructure is the technological, the high-tech infrastructure necessary to sustain the artificial intelligence programs and development and so forth. So they make a big claim on this sort of stuff, which connects with the military. No discussion about overhauling and changing the American health system, okay, which really has shown what the situation is in terms of this privatized system. And if in every country where there's been a big connection between the so-called Blair type, what's called public-private initiative, has been rather a disaster, like Lombardy in Italy and so forth. So I think that these are the winners. These are the winners. And the losers are mostly the working people. And I should add, very important, I did not speak about it, is that in this crisis, Jan knows better than I do, emerging market emerging markets have collapsed. This means that the problem is multiplied, right? Is magnified when it comes to the situation in the emerging market for the masses of the people in emerging market. So basically, these are the winner and the loser, and the losers. Yeah? The winners are the big chunk of monopoly capital I spoke about, and the losers are the working people in advanced countries and more than in advanced countries, but advanced countries should not be neglected in the emerging market. That's the long and the short of it.
Thank you, Joseph. The floor is open to questions and opinions.
Yeah, Jan.
Go.
Yes, I just a comment and a couple of questions. A comment on Tom Ferguson's comment or statement that most of the money for supporting small business went to big business. Reminds me very much of years ago, I think towards the end of the 1980s, the Japanese Employers Federation sent a delegation to Britain to study the policy on small business. They'd heard a lot that in Britain there were these programs for helping small businesses, for helping to finance, finding finance for small business. So this was the, I think the Keidanran it's called, the Japanese Employers Federation, and they after having toured Britain, spoken to lots of companies, spoken to government ministers, and so on, they then wrote a report in which they wrote that there are all these programs in place in Britain to support small businesses. However, the situation in Japan is different because in Japan, most small businesses do contract work for big businesses, and therefore the best way to support small businesses is to give lots more money to big businesses. So this is, in a sense, supports Tom's point. But I want to take up 2 points that you make in your or ask you about 2 points which you made in your lecture, Joseph. One is the Naomi Klein's point about the strengthening of monopoly capital and the links of the big business with the state, and ask you, well, there's or put to you the alternative view of this, which is that of Mariana Mazzucato, namely that actually this relationship between the state and the American IT companies is really a part of the way in which the state creates value and has a positive impact on technological change, and the state policy kind of the state policy is a benign influence on technological development. So that's one point. And then the second point that you made about complex, or your initial point about the complexity of companies, of not companies, of particular countries, And I do wonder whether the how far what you say is true of, say, countries like France or Italy. I mean, have France and Italy been able to cope with the pandemic using domestic resources, or have they had to rely on imports and support from other countries?
Okay. On the Mariana Mazzucato, I think one can share her perspective on one thing. I remember that once I saw a video that she produced. I mean, one of her video stuff. No, not she produced. She was in a conference, in a talk, and she was on the stage, and she often is. So she pulled out an iPhone, a mobile phone, cell phone, from her pocket and said, you know, there's not one element here in this phone which is not the result of public money, of public intervention, of public funded, publicly. She's right on that. Like all the spin-off, technological spin-off, etc., that you get from avionics and stuff like that, there is public money. I mean, even the famous 747, right, was the result of an Air Force plane, big transport plane that the Air Force, American Air Force, did not accept. But they funded the prototype, they funded all this sort of stuff, and then it became a civilian plane. So she's right on that. But she never focuses on the fundamental issue of monopoly capital. Of course, she's right in saying that the government infuses technological research, but then she stops there. One has to look at she does not have a theory of capital accumulation. No. She does not have a view about the structure of capitalism, that is to say, which is today in terms of monopoly capital, in which chunks, you don't always have the same monopoly capital. Things change, but it's monopoly capital that stays, mutates into a different type of monopoly capital, but and doesn't completely lose the others. I mean, the big steel corporations in the United States are still pretty strong in terms of, not so much in terms of overall production, but in terms of their oligopolistic power. So these things don't go away. So that she does not have. So that's she cannot say. What Naomi Klein points is how these people, Google, etc., these technological things are influencing the entire direction of policy, of public policy, and mostly at the expense of the citizenry, also in terms of political rights, because they basically end up controlling everything in terms of data collection, the big data systems, etc., right? You know, there's a lot of physics departments in universities, right? PhD in physics. I know personally people who do that. I mean, PhD in physics, in astrophysics. Astrophysics has become an area of big data. Before it was not. Before it was speculative. Astrophysics has become big data area, and they get jobs in financial companies because they can deal with big data, right? That's what happens. I mean, it continues the merger, which already we saw it in the crisis of 2008. I don't know whether you remember when there were people with cartons, crates of cartons, taking their stuff out of the financial offices in the city of London. Many of them were actually mathematicians.
Yes.
Because they were busy developing derivative structure, derivative options, and etc., where you need a lot of mathematics in terms of probability stuff and so forth. Okay. So in terms of the complexity, the second part, the other question, no, I think, you see, France is actually, has fallen. I don't know whether it was always ever there, but let's say that France deindustrialized significantly. And if you look at the French industrial structure, the core, the one which is viable, so to speak, is the one which is institutionally supported, which is the military industrial complex. That's what it is. They had some civilian computer, right? Like Italy they had the famous Olivetti. It's a very sad story about Olivetti, which was path-breaking, and yet, you know, eventually ended up nowhere, but not because of Olivetti technicians or Olivetti engineers. And France had a number of private companies working in computers with the government, but they're working for the global market. They folded. The civilian market, the consumption market, is all by the standard stuff, you know, Samsung and that sort of stuff, Japanese, whatever it is. But Huawei and so forth. They withdrew into the military industrial complex. France is not at all strong industrially. This. I have to reject that. Sorry, I've got to reject it. Why do people call me now? Okay, and so now Italy, it's a different story. But in what way Italy is a different story? But Italy has got, well, I would say that France has one civilian sector which still is significant, and this is the automobile sector. But the automobile sector is multinationalizing more and more. Yeah. I mean, they aim at Romania, they aim at other places, okay? They are multinationalized, they are delocalizing more and more. The problem with Italy is different in the sense that Italy has lost the big companies. They no longer have big companies in Italy. Fiat has left. For all practical purposes, Turin is the rentier point of Fiat. I think that Pepe can correct me on that. But they control Turin still in terms of the Banco San Paolo and all that sort of stuff. Then Pirelli is not a major, they don't have significant big companies. For a country like Italy, 60 million, it's necessary, okay? And then they did not develop the equivalent, because Italy is very good on capital goods, and it's contrary to what many people in Italy itself think, but it's actually quite good. And they had Ercole Marelli, Magneti Marelli, for instance, Magneti Marelli, which is like Siemens, right? But it is a fraction of Siemens if you compare it to Siemens, okay? And they are gone. Or rather, for instance, in Turin, the Magneti Marelli has been taken by a Japanese company. So maybe that Japanese company will want to strengthen its position in Europe. Maybe it will strengthen that, but it's not, no, in no way they can possibly compete in the same market with Siemens. But they are Siemens-like. They can do the same thing that Siemens does, but they can do it on a much smaller scale. So Italy is not in a position to, is not structurally complete, although the ranking of both Italy and France is sort of, it's not top, but it's 7, 8, 10, something like that. It's at that level. It's 8, 11, something like that. It's at that level. But Italy has got is having a pattern very similar to Britain, you know, very similar to the phases of Britain, the industrialization. Remember, in the 70s, in the 80s, early 80s, people still thought that Britain could produce everything and could, and eventually lost the car industry. Then the car industry got replaced by the transplant from Japan and South Korea and stuff like that. So Italy has got a similar problem, although there won't be transplant from South Korea and Japan in Italy. There will not be, okay? So so in that sense, it does not qualify. The European core, industrial core, is Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic, and Sweden. This is the European coherent industrial core.
Okay.
Thank you for this lively exchange, Joseph and Jan. By the way, in the chat, you will find the links to the 3 authors mentioned by Joseph, Klein, Ferguson, and Mirowski's interview to Libération. The floor is open to other opinions, questions. I would now redefine the military-industrial complex, which titillates, long forgotten areas of my brains. I would redefine it as the military big data complex, perhaps. I would. So, other opinions?
I agree.
Or maybe the military medical IT industrial complex, because this is what essentially you're talking about. Sorry, I'm interrupting. Someone else should speak.
Other opinions? Go on, Gelaila.
Oh, Gelaila, go.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very interesting lecture, Professor. I've noticed certain key ideas in your lecture, and my question will mainly be about them, such as institution or structures, scarcity, and the like. So I was wondering, in a world where we seem to be paying for what is not yet produced, do you think scarcity is creating a culture of its own? And what would be its possible repercussions? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat a bit? Scarcity is creating?
Its own culture, yes?
Its own culture?
Yeah.
But what do you mean that we are paying for things which are not produced? Can you explain this to me?
It's exactly... It's exactly what you said. There seems to be least interest in investment right now. Businesses are closed, but people are yet being paid for as wages, and we also tend to fall quite easily into the trap of the hoarder mentality, and that's where my question is really directed at. Do you think scarcity leaves traces of certain culture within the institutions and structures that you've been mentioning?
Okay, I think that people like Schmidt that from Google understood perfectly well that it does create a culture that is the culture of not having contact, right? Of shying from contact, of trying to accepting a situation, a quasi contactless situation. And therefore this eliminates, in my view, it weakens certainly the interest for some kind of collective action, because what is needed is collective action. What in America they call collective action, okay? In Europe, they call it social struggles, which is a better term, okay? Which is much better. In America, they call it collective actions, okay? So it reduces, obviously, the bonds and the drive and the dynamics necessary to undertake collective action. It seems to me that the subaltern classes, am I using this kind of outdated terms it was invented by Italian Gramscian people in the 17th classi subalterne, right? Subaltern class, that they are much weaker now. Yeah, it creates that sort of culture. I mean, that's what interests me, in the sense that it creates, it weakens the possibility of collective action. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Okay, can I ask?
Please, Federico, go.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the compelling lecture. I just want to put some reflection and finally an answer. So as you pointed out, I think that a risky factor is represented by the increasing size of the monopoly of digital infrastructure. But I mean, some news about this crisis are represented by the fact that we are even more aware by the fact that who dominates the digital infrastructure at the same time dominate the physical infrastructure. I'm referring especially about trade. So about the increased role, the increased monopoly of Amazon, for example. And the risk is that an infrastructure, physical, digital, like Amazon, or like some others related to gig economy actors, players, are going to be even more pressing and important and dominant on the international scheme that lacks of public or more or less shared between states, institutional actors frame, no? So looking for solutions, thinking about how to get away from this situation, as you said before regarding the leftist thinking, for example, I want to refer more in general to those who want to oppose this situation, leftist or not. Do you think that there is a sort of, just to quote Etienne de la Boétie, servitude, voluntary servitude in the minds of those who want to oppose? So directly or indirectly, I can see that some actors that want to change the system are implicitly giving importance. They want to change the system without changing the key elements of the system. So sort of social dem, like the Blairian third way, for example. On the other side, I can see that some other players want to change the system, but they didn't take at all into account economic and financial elements. So they are still stuck at a 20th century vision. What do you think about?
What, can you give me an example about this last case that you made about stuck in the 20th century vision?
Yeah, for example, I know a lot of movements in Italy that are more radical or less radical, but very, very involved in social situations in Italy that want to want to implement some features. For example, l'Europa dei popoli, Europe as a federal state, but it seems that they push only on the traditional liberal freedoms, liberal rights, political rights, and taking for granted that the economic and social rights are those, and they don't put into discussion the liberal identity given to social economical rights. If there is if it could be a conception of liberal economic and social rights. So I don't know if I was clear or...
Very clear, yeah. And so what do I think about this?
Yeah, do you think that who is currently opposing had the means to oppose, or is still considering the entire situation, not only in a social, liberal, right way, but even taking into account finance and economic monopolies?
Well, what I think is that my view is that unfortunately what happened in the last, 40 years, 30 perhaps, I don't know, I mean, you decide, is that within the left there is either an acceptance of some kind of banal Keynesianism, that is more public money, more public expenditure, that sort of stuff, you know, or there is complete abandonment of any view about political economy. That the argument is in a capitalist society, political economy has to be center stage. You cannot address the issue through voluntarism. You must have an analytical understanding, and then you must know the actual forces of capital, the actual forces. You can have a general theory of monopoly capital, but then you must know what are the actual forces of capital. So in the 50s, when people wrote about monopoly, oligopoly, etc., they had exactly a pretty exact view of what it meant. It meant the big corporations, especially in automobile, in steel, in that sort of stuff. And then after that, what happened with the development of monopoly capital in communications and all this sort of stuff, there was no necessary development of the analysis of application of the theories of the approach of monopoly capital, the necessary change to these new dimensions. Like even very limited, in my view, the connection between financial capital and monopoly capital. Few people have done. Jan Toporowski is one of them, but is not widespread. So even among the people in the left has become essentially voluntaristic. But I don't think there is such a left. You know, it's a left is you know, a few thousands individual here and there, but it's not a social factor anymore. That's what I think.
Now there is a question by Mariella. Ciao to Ugo, who got mixed up with timing. Thank you for being with us. Mariella, you got the floor.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Halevi. Hi, Professor Toporowski. I have two questions. One is about China digital currency that they're releasing now in May, and what are the implications since the US is going to be hit hard by this crisis and they're releasing lots of dollars, and what are going to be the outcomes of that event? And the other one is some thoughts of capitalism surveillance, the argument evolved by Professor Shoshana Zuboff, and what is this replacement by humans from factor of production to raw material for this new era of capitalism surveillance? Since you're talking, you addressed a lot the question of the shift from production to the cyberspace, the production in cyberspace. Thank you.
Okay. I think the first question, Jan Toporowski can answer better than I do. Jan?
Yeah, okay. On the dollars, all I will say is that every crisis strengthens the position of the dollar, and for you know, and this you can see even in the present crisis, and this is totally unrelated to the state of the American economy. What it has to do with is it has to do with the financial circulation of the dollar, and the fact that behind the dollar are these markets for U.S. government bonds, and it's this that makes the dollar strong. I would also, you know, add to this, and I don't want to. I could give a whole lecture on this. Is the fact that the interbank markets no longer function as they used to. They're all based on dollar swaps, and in this sense, you know, Europe is becoming dollarized now, not because we use dollars, but because the banks use dollars when they borrow and lend between each other, and this is what accounts for the decline in the role of the euro. So I can see the dollar as strengthening, and in particular because the Federal Reserve now has these currency swap arrangements with other central banks. Yeah.
That's right. And actually, a few days ago, Tom Ferguson told me that the Federal Reserve has opened a window, a repo window, which is available to all the other central banks. And they're actually providing dollars to China as well. Yeah.
Okay.
They've allowed China to access that repo window, which
wow.
is top. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Bereket for a question. Bereket?
No, the second question is about humanless production, okay? Now, I think that we have to make a distinction. If you look at the level of industrial employment, of employment in connection to this new activity, so to speak, employment is not falling, okay? I mean, the number of salaried people in the world has actually increased. So what is happening is a different mechanism. So Amazon expands, right? So they need big centers, like there was in Italy, I think it was Piacenza, a big center of distribution of Amazon. And they have hundreds and hundreds of workers there, of people. Most of these people are actually in precarious, in the type of employment, the contract nature of that employment is rather shoddy, precarious, no? And in fact, they went on strike even on that. I don't know what was the outcome of that. So these kind of services, these kind of activities don't necessarily eliminate jobs, but they may downgrade jobs, okay? You follow me?
Yeah. Yeah.
You follow? It's like the development of big, Los Angeles that was full of janitors, and they even had a strike there, janitors and service people, because with all these skyscrapers and these offices, etc., they needed cleaners and etc. So this type of employment expanded. This is pointed out also in a book about 20 years ago. James Galbraith, he wrote a very good book, which is called Born Unequal. Made unequal. And it's about the precarious unemployment that exists. Yes, sectors where employment is stable, sectors where employment is unstable, and sectors which are receiving the free fall from the upper sectors. And these are janitors, McDonald's jobs, this sort of stuff. These jobs are expanding, but they are expanding. You basically have a form of activities which push people to subsistence level. A wage at McDonald's is a subsistence wage.
Yeah.
If you are a normal employee at McDonald's, if you are a manager, maybe not, right? Certainly not a manager of a McDonald's complex, not. But if you are an employee, then you tend towards subsistence. This is what's happening. Not so much that jobs are, is not the old debate, not so much the old debate, about machinery and labor that Barton, Ricardo, and then Karl Marx came in as well, later on. It's not so much about that. It's about the fact that jobs are being downgraded and people fall into a kind of semi-employed jobs. So today we are in a situation where unemployment, or precarious or underemployment enters into employment. This is what's happening.
Thank you, Josefian and Mariella. Now Bereket.
Okay, thank you for the interesting lecture, Professor. So my question is, I think developing countries, and you also mentioned about the transition economies, and they are among the losers out of the pandemic. So I was just wondering as what could be done for especially developing and the transition economies to increase their resilience to similar occurrences in the future. So what would be the regulatory or economic measures that could be that could help these countries mitigate the adverse outcomes of pandemics and similar occurrences in the future? Thank you.
Okay, I would like to say very briefly, perhaps Jan Taborowski would have a better reply, but there have been so many people, right? Academics from the capitalist imperialist world that have given advice to the former colonial countries when they received independence. And I don't want to be one of them. I don't want to be one of those people that give my blueprint, which I don't have. This depends on the political processes that exist in the countries that you refer to. And of course, these differ. You know, the situation in Africa, it depends which part of Africa, which country in Africa, and the situation in India are very different. I mean, really very different. The situation in Brazil, you know, very different compared. So I cannot, I mean, we cannot have a general view about what the developing countries or the emerging economies should do. This should come from the countries concerned. But just think about the fact that why the Organization of African Unity has not produced that much, you know, of a result. I mean, this is a matter that these are matters that really have to be addressed by the intellectual and political development in the countries concerned.
We got some other minutes for other questions and opinions. So one general question to the advantage of our students and of myself is about the distinction you made, which is the leading, I think, factor of this talk, the distinction you made between demand-driven crisis and offer-driven crisis. Would you expand on that?
Well, I mean, the 1930s crisis was a classical demand-driven crisis because once the financial crisis spelled itself out, it became investment fell, and investment through the Keynesian multiplier, right? I mean, full investment, fall in income, full employment, etc., etc. That's demand-driven. Supply-driven crisis can be done because there is a blockage to production or because there is an increase in the cost of production. That was in the 70s. In the 70s, for some industrialized countries, of course, that's what happened to the increase in the price of raw materials, of oil and raw materials. That was an increase in the cost and created a problem. It created inflation, essentially. Then they pinned it on wages. That's what happened. The inflation was generated. There was, let's say, some kind of good inflation, which was the result that in Europe, or also in the United States, because of the Vietnam War, there was high level of employment, nearly full employment, let's say, roughly speaking, not really full, but anyway, high level of employment. And then unions managed to demand higher wages, but also they demanded higher wages because when unemployment is high, demand for certain things is high, like rental, like houses and etc., rental, etc. So it feeds back onto wages. Unions took the opportunity to demand higher wages. That impacted on inflation, but really not really dramatically in my view. The big impact was through the oil price increase. Then they pinned it on wages, and they started to deflate wages. In the mid-70s, they started to deflate wages. Some countries got it early to wage deflation. One of that was was Germany. Another one was France with Raymond Barre, deflationary policies of Raymond Barre. Italy took longer, and Britain also took a bit longer until Margaret Thatcher came and started to, by 1983, they managed to start deflating wages. Even that, it took a bit of time, but so that's the two. Now we have simultaneity. Output is blocked, right? Is impeded, is prevented. But the prevention of output generates a fall in demand, right? Because if you prevent output, then workers have to be sent home in one way or another, less pay, less demand, investment stops, and the Keynesian multiplier operates in reverse, reduces income and output and employment. Yeah, that's the mechanism.
Thank you, Joseph. We got time for another couple of questions.
If I may.
Please, Giancarlo, go.
First of all, thanks, Professor Halevi. And it's very nice to listen to you again. I am a former IUC student two academic years ago. And I have a comment, and then I would like to ask your opinion about something. Well, the comment is that you started off by saying, actually you concluded saying that the winners are these big high-tech companies and monopoly capital, while workers are the losers. And can we say that, I mean, workers have been losers for centuries. So it appears that, I mean, somehow winners change and losers stay the same somehow. It depends, of course, on the level of abstraction of the analysis. But anyway, my question, the opinion I'm asking you is about the current situation, because you rightly mentioned that industrial capacity, productive capacity, is an essential factor in identifying winners, or at least states that can react promptly to this crisis. And so we see states like Germany, which reacted better. Although maybe this is questionable anyway, and while Italy, for example, suffered more from the crisis. So I would like to ask you what's your opinion about what's happening now in Europe, since we know that being part of the European Monetary and Economic Union, Economic and Monetary Union, sorry, it's I mean, the EMU itself does not distribute benefits evenly among European states. And so I would like to know whether you envision any kind of strategy that Italy can adopt right now, because I mean, so far I have already heard many debates about what Italy should do. Many say that Italy should exit EMU. I would say that exiting EMU would be insane right now, although the best moment to exit economic and monetary union would be when things get better, but I think no one would think of leaving when things are better. And so I was wondering whether, I mean, injections of money are enough in this situation, since you mentioned that productive capacity is essential for economic growth. So I don't know, what could be a strategy or any idea you have on that for Italy to get out of this situation?
This is like asking what the developing countries should do. Right? Because if I can answer this, this is a dead end situation whereby the rational thing to do, rational, in a sense we are all rational people, which is not the case, right? But we are all rational in government, except governments are rational. So they sit around the table a bit more or less like at Bretton Woods, which even then, you know, in the end, it was not so rational. But they sit around the table and said, what we should do, EMU is not working. How should we replace it, repair it, replace it? So that would be the rational thing to do, and would come up with all sorts of proposals, semi-proposals and stuff like that. But this is not the case. So I really do not see any alternative strategies, right? Except perhaps I have warmed up, but I'm not sure, I cannot give you my professional, how shall I say, imprimatur to these sort of things. But I can give you a certain, I started to warm up to the idea that was put forward by a friend of mine who is also the son of my late professor, Paolo Siroslabini, Stefano Siroslabini, with other people, has been pushing for Schacht type of money, you know, the type of bond called fiscal currency, which would not impact, according to him, on public expenditure, on the public debt, and would not be in contrast to the EMU, and would allow creation of expenditure and demand in Italy. I have warmed up because exiting, you are right, exiting is a complete disaster. Accepting austerity and a second time round for Italy would be a total disaster. I would really urge everybody to read a paper by Servaas Storm. Servaas Storm, like storm, but Storm, S-T-O-R-M, has written a paper, Lost in Deflation, which is a very good paper on the macroeconomy of Italy. He is a professor at in a Dutch university. It's a very good paper on the macroeconomy of Italy since the 80s, where he points out the deflationary mechanism that started to work in Italy. So Italy cannot afford. This is been published on the website of INET website. You say Servaas, S-E-R-V-A-A-S, Storm, like storm. And he has got a very good paper there. I do not have an answer to these sort of things. I mean, the situation is pretty much stalled, in my view. So perhaps Jan Toporowski would have something more to say or different.
No, on the whole, I agree with you. I mean, I think your analysis is, has always been fundamentally sound and very close to mine. I don't know the paper by Stefano Siroslabini. I know some of Servaas Storm's work. I think it's very good. I think that the real there is one possible way out, which has never been properly investigated in terms of supporting fiscal policy, and that is greater use of debt management offices. You see, everyone focuses on the adequacies or inadequacies of the European Central Bank. Actually, governments in the European Union have an instrument of monetary policy, and that is their debt management office. And this, I think, could be used more effectively. But this is a topic really for a much longer discussion.
So before a question by Brooke, in the chat, you have the reference to Storm's paper that Joseph mentioned, and also the reference to James Galbraith's book, Created Unequal. You got the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for a very nice presentation and insightful points raised by the professors. My question is related to the impact of the political impact of states' ideology on the creation of losers and winners. I have read an article which is written by the South Korean commentator Boyang Chul. He specifically focused on the categorization of state as liberal and non-liberal states, and its impact on the creating of categories of state like, as you said, winner and losers. And he specifically focuses on the authoritarian mentality of those Asian countries and some African countries in terms of having a status of winner. So what can we say in terms of contribution of creating a loser and loser status made by the political ideologies, or the contribution of political ideology in terms of creating loser and winner status? Thank you.
But when he refers to authoritarian countries in Asia, what does he refer to? Because there are authoritarian countries and authoritarian countries. They are not all the same, right? I mean, there are authoritarian countries which I don't think they were losers. You know, I mean, they were, but then the authoritarianism did not work after a certain point of time, and they had to quit. That is South Korea. The South Korea, the big industrialization, of course, was in the context of the Vietnam War. It was in the context in which the United States needed a strong country also in order to face up to both as a model and as a strengthening of its allies and so forth. But South Korea, the big industrialization of South Korea started in the early 60s, 1961, with a military coup d'etat, okay, which was led by a soldier who was in the former Kwantung Army, the Japanese occupying army in China, okay? So, but he was Korean, was Korean. And that was, and they started with Japan supporting them and providing intelligence and providing investment, really, and the United States paying for a lot of it. They started the big industrialization program, which essentially lasted till 1980s, in the early 80s. This authoritarian, because in 1980 there was a big uprising in South Korea, workers' uprising, big one in the city in South Korea, and that created the end of the model. The model ended a few years later when they moved with President Roh Tae-woo. They moved to a more liberal democratic approach, less authoritarian, right? But authoritarianism sometimes works. I mean, it also worked in Japan in the 1930s, and it worked in Nazi Germany. I mean, let's not have fetishism about authoritarianism. Now, whether we like it or not, that's a different story. Whether we like the political system or not, I would not subscribe to the German or the Japanese authoritarianism of the 30s just because of economic development. But we should but we should not make it a fetish. Yeah. So it depends what kind of authoritarianism we are talking about and in what time frame.
Okay, perhaps a very last question, if anyone has a question, or Joseph, if you want to conclude.
Yeah, what is real? I don't like a party congress. We have to conclude. No.
We could vote on your motion. If you like. Okay, thank you for this very lively debate. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Jan. Thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you all. I miss you all.
And we miss you, Joseph. I would like to remind you that next week, Monday the 25th at 1700, 5 p.m. Central European Time, we will have Tom Ferguson. The topic is industrial structure and social conflict in the age of COVID-19. I hope to see you all and at this appointment. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So what shall I do, leave?
Please.